A long, long time ago, I would make YouTube videos. That's how it used to be. Then I got some tech and I started filming Dune Messiah, and then I filmed it 6 times in a row. So this is my 6th time filming, so this is going to be the most to the point and succinct as possible. And I'm not a succinct person, so, you know, it's going to be normal. Dune Messiah. I said this would be the first video I made when I got some microphone. Here it is. Let's go. Succinct. Spoilers for this video for the very first Dune book. No spoilers for the second book. The only things about the second book we're going to talk about are the premises. Pretty much what's up front in the first act. Even if I wanted to talk about more, there's nothing really else to talk about. Because nothing happens in this book. It's a good ending. The last 50 pages or so are good, but nothing happens. This is a book about a man sitting in a chair. The book makes very clear, this is what a chair is. This is what a butt is. And here is how these two things go together. And that's the entire book, without exaggeration. I'll go ahead and put up a thing here I prepared when I tried to edit a video that didn't work. The Wikipedia summary for Dune Messiah. The first 75% of the book is the first 2 paragraphs, and then the second half, more than half, is the last 75 pages. Nothing happens in this book. And yet, my opinion on it has at least changed slightly making all of these videos. That's one of the reasons I made a 6th one instead of a 5th one. Because after really thinking about it, my opinion has changed slightly. Paul is the emperor, and things have happened. Nothing happens in the book, but things have happened in those 15 years. This is like a catch-up. You get caught up pretty quickly, but let's get into it. The prologue starts great. Most prologues I don't care about. Prologues are like, you tried. This is in that 5% of prologues that are phenomenal. You have a group of people. You have all of Paul's enemies together, and they're plotting against him at this off-planet, off Dune. You have the Bene Gesserit. You have the Spacing Guild. You have House Coronio. That's not us. Coronio, the Emperor's house. The Padish Emperor's old house. Via Irulan, whose beef with Paul is that he won't, they're married, and he won't, that. And the Bene Telexo, who are key to this book, in the way that someone could be to this book, but they don't quite have the same flavor. Going forward, once you hit books like 5 and 6, the Bene Telexo are my favorite faction in Dune. Space Muslims. That flavor's not quite here. They're mostly just making clones and duplicates of other, which we'll get into. That's one of the important things to talk about. So you have this group, that old cartoon for DC where all the villains came up in the swamp and they're in a Darth Vader head. I got this right in my last video. There's a swamp, and then all the DC villains meet together to destroy the Justice League. It's in a Legion of Doom. Their name is the Legion of Doom. Every villain is DC. Doom. Evid. Okay, I'm getting off track. And then on top of the basic prologue, you do have a fun little start where you have the Fremen out off-world, and one of them drowns because it's the first time ever seeing an ocean. And the context is important, and that's what to talk about, because the Fremen are on a jihad. None of this crusade stuff we used for the movie. No, they are on a jihad, and they have killed 50 billion plus people. And that's where a lot of people like to look at Paul and say, Paul is the bad guy. Ooh, look at the subversion of the hero trope. And we can't get into that fully until I go to Dune, Children of Dune. We can discuss the entire series. But I will say from a basic premise standpoint, Paul never really made a choice outside of to save himself. It was either save himself or sort of on the path he is now. There's perhaps a bit of a moral quandary there when you say, if I save myself from this horrible fate and 60 billion people die, is it worth it? But at the same time, it's hard to hate him for that, view him directly. Obviously, he's he's cognizant, he's prescient, he knows it's going to happen. Is that his fault or is that the system's fault? Because in true sci-fi faction, this almost gets a bit more into the Asimovian foundation, where you can put all the blame you want on the individual, but the individual is not in control. Paul is the emperor, but Paul is not in control in the way you would typically think of the emperor being in control. He doesn't want this to happen. He has absolutely no control over the Fremen murdering billions of innocent people and, some non-innocent. He's stuck in a system. It's an oppressive system. And that was the oppressive system he was fighting in the first book. In the first book, you have this imperial system vis-a-vis the original medieval caste system, if you will. And that is what's inherently flawed. And for Paul to destroy that caste system and fight against it, this is the inevitable result. So is Paul wrong, or is the system wrong? Objectively, the system is wrong, I think. I think Paul has the handicap, or the reversed handicap, whatever that is, where Paul's not a super likable character. Even in the first book, he's sort of that stereotypical heroish character, but I think part of his problem is that people don't necessarily love him. And even as a huge fan of the Dune books, I don't necessarily love Paul. So he's not sympathetic in a way where you necessarily want to coddle him and be like, everything's going to be okay. It's not your fault. And then there's the second prong here, where Paul is prescient. He is on the golden path. This is the best path for humanity. So we got a little self-justification coming in through the text, sort of Doctor Strange in-game style, Infinity War, where this is bad, but it is the best, apparently. In the very least, if humanity is going to grow and evolve and move beyond the system, this is apparently the only way to do it. And there are certainly worse fates. And so, how are you going to judge that? Now, if I'm making this book sound interesting, because I haven't started talking about the plot yet, but I have started talking about the plot, because the plot is him sitting in a chair thinking about these things, and there's like a mile-long throne room decorated with phallic imagery. And they have to walk a mile through his throne room to meet him, looking at phallic imagery. And then they get there and they talk about this stuff, and that's the book. Now, it's not world building for 250 pages. It is just... This is all interesting in terms of one book as a sequel compared to the other, and that Dune, you might call it sci-fi, but Dune was very much a fantasy adventure, the prototypical hero's journey. He's going to go out, he's going to beat the bad guy, become the emperor, yada yada. There is some derision when it comes to this book historically. Not always people's favorite. It's a critic's darling, and I think it is a critic's darling because you're in a context like I am right now talking about it. There is stuff to talk about. If you're at home reading it without a friend to talk to, or without going onto videos and listening to losers like me talk, then it's pretty boring. Because of sort of the implicit stuff you can pull out of it if you want to really look at it critically. On a base level, Dune Messiah is not fantasy like the original book. It is hard sci-fi, as I mentioned, like the Foundation Asimovian, where we are just talking about ideas. There is no plot. There's not a lot. Character work, what have you. There is ideas. But they aren't necessarily being challenged and being explored thoroughly in this book on its own. It's ideas you can pull out of. It's very much a do you want to do the work kind of book. If you love Dune, you might not necessarily love this book because it's a different genre, which conceptually is fantastic. I love the idea that you're changing it up. In practice, though, I am with the majority by saying this is generally a boring book. Before I really sat down and made these videos and thought about it, I was prepared to write it off completely and just say it's a boring book where a man sits on a chair and it's got a good beginning, good ending. I must concede it's interesting to talk about it in this context, but unless you want to have a discussion, like we're doing now, it's not a great book. But wait, there has to be more, right? There's one thing more. There is one thing more to talk about, in which the inciting incident and the general thrust on this plot on Paul's life, did I say they were trying to kill Paul? They're trying to kill Paul. Is that they have resurrected Idaho Duncan as a quote-unquote Gola. Get it? Ghoul? I've been reading Asimov's Words of Science, topical. Ghoul comes from the Arabic for alcohol. Get it? People stumbling drunk through cemeteries. Ooh, ghouls. Yeah, that's really cute. I really like that. Really, for those of you who haven't read the first book in a while, I think we all have a generally good impression of Ido. He was a fun character, but he's not in it a lot. And I think part of the reason he's sort of elevated to a more interesting character is because he had a really good and unexpected death. Almost at a Song of Ice and Fire, where you cut their potential short. Their story's not done. You just cut their legs out from under them. You say, oh, whoa, didn't see that coming. But now he's back in the form of a ghoul named Hate, H-A-Y-T. It's either Hate, which is way too on the nose, or Hyatt, which is a hotel. So I choose Hate, I guess. Hate is better than the other one. And there's a rule when you're writing, generally. I've heard it said, I don't know whose rule it is. I'll put it up here if I remember. Where if you're going to bring a character back, first off, don't. But if you're going to do it, bringing them back has to be worse than them staying dead. Right? Because it's such a cheap way. So really, you have to make the audience wish it didn't happen. Here, it's built in where they kind of do that by saying, this is part of the plot to kill Paul. But at the same time, Paul immediately recognizes that and says, Gambit accepted. I'll have my friend back, and you're not going to get one over on me. I'm psychic. So it really diffuses any sort of negative implications because you have trust in Paul. You have faith in his psychic abilities to know that, I can handle this situation. And this is probably, it's not as negative as the cabal, the evil group wants it to be. The resurrection, if you will, really leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I don't know what the general consensus on this is, but I can't imagine your average person just being okay with dead characters coming back to life. There's some sci-fi stuff in there to explain how he's a clone, but he actually has the memories. Whatever, don't care. But, I don't know. Maybe I'm giving people too much credit because, Stranger Things. Character dies at the end of every season. Are they dead or they're not? Oh, they're back. Ooh, we love it. It's the best show ever. Sucks. This was a bit of a retcon, a la Michael Crichton. Where it's like, I'm bringing him back because I like him, and more importantly, the audience likes him. But unlike other times, like Michael Crichton, whatever, the Dune books going forward are in many ways an attempt to justify this plot convenience, which is interesting, and that's something to talk about another day. But at least he does something with it going forward, which means when you read backwards like I do, when you've read this a second time after the entire saga, it reads better than the first time. But that's the plot. You're saying, that's not a plot, that's just the setup. That's the plot. They're in a room, there's a ghoul, there's people wanting to kill Paul, and they talk about it, and they think about it in that sort of hyper-stylized Dune way, where it's like, he's coming in, I'm thinking about it. His eyes moved a quarter of a degree to the bottom right, which means last Tuesday he met with his evil people and plotted specifically to use a knife, because if it was a gun, it would be the other way. It would be a fraction of a degree more. And you get the hyperbole, right? In Dune, it did this too, but it was in service of more action and adventure and more stereotypical storytelling style. Here, you remove all of that, so you're just you're left with, that's it. That's what you're here for the next 250 pages, is just people really overanalyzing the slightest body movements. Their body movements. What does this mean? What does this mean, Paul? That's getting cut. And it's also very Paul-centric. There are perhaps more interesting characters like Paul's preborn sister, Alia, but we don't get to stick with her too much. And honestly, it's pretty much where I'm done talking. There's not much else to talk about. The ending is good. The ending goes a long way to bringing this up. And you have the narrative thrust at the beginning, the first however many pages with the Cabal and the initial settings, have a lot of drive to carry you through, but it's still going to be a bit of a slog. And I guess before I can give my rating, there's one other thing to talk about, in that A few years ago, I saw a novel theory online, as so many are, and it's spread, and I've seen a lot of people talk about it, enough to the point that I want to address it because it's a stupid theory, and that Dune Messiah is actually the third act, or the last part of the third act of Dune, and these are actually all one book. It's sort of like, I don't know, a decade ago, you go online, you see a theory about signs. Signs isn't about aliens. Signs is about demons, because they can't open doors. Aliens could open doors. Water, holy water, what? Must be. M. Night Shyamalan is a genius. It was novel in that way, this third act theory, because much like the signs theory or many others we could point out, it's not really justified by the text. If you, the reader, are putting extra stuff into it, you could perhaps manufacture this. But I feel it interested to point out because so many people have talked about it in the past, and I've seen that come up anytime Dune comes up, Dune Messiah comes up, really. And the fact of the matter is, and I think people say this because Dune ends abruptly. The third act of Dune is sort of its weakest point. Paul's in a coma, wakes up, climax, immediately over. It's like that third Transformers movie where Optimus Prime just shoots him in the head and it's just over. Which, no one's coming to the defense of Michael Bay because he doesn't make good and smart movies. But when you have a genius like Mr. Herbert just have a weird shtick like that, a weird little then people say, no, it can't be bad. He can't have structured it poorly. He must be a secret genius. And no, we can call it a mistake. Because this book, while incredibly boring, and that's the second half of it, is that the first one ends abruptly, and the second one, nothing happens. So much, by their powers combined, you've got a full book, right? It's got an inciting incident, it's got a first act, it's got a turn, it's got a third act. Everything's here. It's just kind of boring. As a rating, I will give this a 5 out of 10. 5 out of 10. It was a 5 out of 10 before I sort of flipped on my opinion and thought about this sort of extra stuff you can pull out, because it is a transitionary piece. It gets us to Children of Dune. It lets us know how the first book ended, but I don't see it being as subversive or as interesting. I think the real value that you can get out of this book is having conversations with people who have all these extreme opinions about Dune Messiah and all these extreme opinions about Paul and his hypocrisy and whatnot. But I don't think Paul's a hypocrite, at least not to the extent that we've seen yet. There will be an interesting conversation to be had in Children of Dune regarding, well, Paul's hypocrisy to a smaller extent, but also perhaps Herbert's hypocrisy as well, or his failure necessarily to deliver the themes and the premises he was laying out and what he's sort of said and talked about regarding these books. I think the books aren't failures. I don't think that. But I think some of his intentions perhaps were. But that's for another time. So I'm giving Dune Messiah a 5 out of 10. And it's better if you want to talk about it with people, but it's still a 5 out of 10 even then. I'm looking at the time and it was not that succinct. And that was my big problem making this video, and almost why I had that turn, because really there are things to talk about. There are conversations to be had regarding this book. But my takeaway is, you can tell a story, it's not there.